So we're going to move into the second workshop on LSO. We're going to start off just giving a brief sort of overview of all the different parts of the LSO architecture and a few little quick sort of highlight examples. We're then going to delve in a little bit more deeply into a few different topics. We'll look at the intent-based orchestration, and then we'll cover the Presto and Legato reference points, which is within a provider, and then finally after lunch, we'll come back and talk about Sonata, which is the inter-provider part. And that's us. So before we sort of dive into the technical, I always like to sort of think about, you know, what's the driver for all of this. This is some data from the MEF survey, which was at the end of last year, I think. You know, and you can see there that the top business driver for migration is service provisioning, more efficient, faster service provisioning. It's not just the top, but it was 100% response rate on that one. And you can see the other things around there are all really to do with orchestration and automation. So being able to offer different services, new services, being able to rapidly roll out new services, being able to make rapid adjustments to existing services, allow your subscribers to dynamically change aspects of the service, you know, bandwidth or class of service, or performance objectives. These are all in the top drivers for service providers, and that's all around orchestration and automation. What are the challenges? So engineering expertise and technical resource topped the list, but then second was orchestration across multiple provider networks. So that's very much something that's the LSO architecture is addressing. Orchestration across multiple domains within a provider. So again, that's something that the LSO architecture is covering. OSS, BSS, you know, needing to refresh those and update them to be able to handle these new services and to be able to handle being more agile and being able to change things much more quickly. And then integrating new services into legacy infrastructure. So again, that's trying to integrate the new things with the existing. So, you know, other than maybe the top one, the engineering expertise, you know, all of these are aspects of LSO. You know, they're all sort of pointing towards some need for rejuvenating the way that we manage and automate and orchestrate services. So we've got a few slides here where we'll just sort of look at, you know, what does this actually look like inside a service provider. So here's a sort of very high-level view of what happens. Your customer comes along and, you know, using some portal or some way or another tells you what sort of service they want. That's the subscriber intent. That goes into your internal business apps, service orchestration, management systems, whatever they are. And out at the bottom pops some stuff that programs your network to actually implement that service. So LSO is really looking at that magic that happens in the middle. How do I translate between what my subscriber asked me for into what I need to do in my network to make it happen? So if we expand that out a little bit more, there's sort of two, well, three maybe major components to that. There's certainly a layer of business applications at the top, you know, that deal with all of the business layer type stuff. So not specific to a given type of service, but just to do with you know, managing contacts and dealing with where things are, locations, quoting, billing, how do I advertise what services I offer, all of those sorts of things. You know, that's all dealt with in the business apps. And that feeds down into some sort of service orchestrator where we turn what the subscriber wanted for the actual service. Something has to sort of figure out how to decompose that, what the different parts are, how do they fit together. And then they program that into some infrastructure controllers, might be one, might be more than one, that actually control different parts of the network. On the subscriber side, there's some sort of ordering, billing, quoting, business layer interactions that go into the top part. And then there might also be some service control and reporting interactions. So once they've got the service and it's all up and running, they might want to tweak things, change things. They might want to know how well it's performing. Are there any faults? Things like that. So you can see there's several interactions between different parts illustrated there, and in the LSO architecture, we give those all names. You'll get familiar with these names if you're not already. Cantata and Allegro are the interactions between the customer and the service provider. Legato and Presto are the interactions between the different layers within the service provider. But of course, we know that things aren't always restricted to one service provider. You have to maybe interact with other providers and operators to enable you to reach outside your own network to locations that you don't have presence in. So you might need to interact with some partner operators. So they have a similar hierarchy of systems within their network, and those interactions happen both at the business layer, again, to do with quoting and billing and ordering, and at the orchestration level to deal with control, dynamic control, and reporting, performance reporting or fault reporting. So those interfaces are called Sonata and Interlude. And this is really the LSO reference architecture that's outlined in MEF 55. You've probably seen this in some form or other several times before, particularly if you've been coming to these events for a few years. So there it is again. That's probably the more familiar picture. Same information. We'll talk a little bit more about each of these interfaces. So start off with Cantata. This is the customer, the end user interacting with the business layer. So it's things like product catalog, product feasibility. Do you offer a service that's what I want? Okay, you do. Can I order it? If I can order it, then we do service activation testing. I need to report the result of that. Did I manage to provision the service you asked for? And then, tracking usage, billing for it, dealing with trouble reports and the status of those, and product level quality. So is the service performing as it should? Move down to Allegro. So this is more of the orchestration layer interactions between the customer and the service provider. So this is looking at things like dynamic control, changing bandwidth on demand, changing class of service on demand, and also reporting. So real-time reporting of the performance of the service, real-time reporting of faults or alerts, and just generally reporting on information about the current running of the service back to the subscriber. So that's the customer subscriber, and then we've got Sonata Interlude, which are very similar sorts of interactions, covering similar sorts of things. So serviceability, this is to do with address validation. Can you offer me a service at this location, and how do I specify that location? Swipe queries, and then product qualification. So does the thing you're offering meet my needs? And if I need this, can you offer that? If you can, how much is it going to cost me? So that's quoting. And there's various sorts of levels of quoting that you can do. Okay, that's all good. Can I now order it? Having ordered it, can I then read back what I've ordered? So it's in inventory. So those first four are what forms the release 4 of the Sonata SDK, which was released, I think, last week or week before. And you can download that now off the MEF website. And then the last 3 are not included in the SDK yet. We're just starting to work on those. So that's things like trouble ticketing, billing, contract negotiation, those sorts of things. Moving down to Interlude. Interlude is very, very similar to Allegro. So that's talking about dynamic control of on-demand changes to bandwidth and class of service, and reporting of faults and performance. And then we look internally within one of the domains. So this is Legato and Presto. So Legato is from the business apps down into the orchestration. So it's service catalog and specifications. What services does the orchestration layer actually provide? Service ordering. Ordering here is a bit of a misnomer because this is all an internal interaction. It's not really ordering as such. It's more provisioning. It would be a better word. But ordering is a word that we've inherited from the other standards bodies for this function. So we're trying to keep terminology aligned across the industry. So we call it service ordering, but really this is talking about service provisioning, configuration and activation of the service. service inventory, what services exist at the orchestration layer, read information back about them, and then notifications, so notifications about changes to the service or about performance of the service back up to the business layer. So that might be, for example, evaluating the SLS that's in the service and saying, okay, for this time period, I met the SLS or I didn't meet the SLS, and pushing that back up into the business apps because it might have an impact on credits that go back to the subscriber, or it might have an impact on notifications to the subscriber. Problem management, that's obviously relating to the trouble ticketing we talk about at the business layer, but that falls down into problem management at the orchestration layer, quality and SLA management, activation testing, qualification, so all of these things that have to sort of happen in order to bring up the service and make sure it's all working correctly. So again, the Legato, the first 4 of those are in release 3 of the Legato SDK. Again, it's available on the MEF website. That's been there, I think, for 6 months or so. There'll be a new version coming out in the new year. And then we sort of go down the stack into Presto. So Presto is the sort of northbound interface to your domain controllers, if you like. So it's the interface between the end-to-end orchestration that happens at the orchestration layer and the sort of domain-specific orchestration that a domain controller might do. So a domain controller might be an SD-WAN controller. It might be something like SD-WAN NFV. It might be some legacy OSS system or legacy NMS. So there's all sorts of different domain controllers, and they might control different parts of your network. There can be more than one. Similar sort of functions to Legato, but now we're talking about resource layer rather than service layer, so it's resource configuration activation, things like topology and path computation, OAM, so again, performance, both provisioning performance measurements and then reporting the corresponding performance measurements. And same with faults, alarms, TCA reporting, that's threshold crossing alerts. So if you've got performance measurements going on, rather than polling for the data, you might want to get an alert if something isn't working quite as it should, if it crosses the threshold. And this applies across all of the different types of services, K, Ethernet, Layer 1, IP, and so on. So I'm going to hand over to Karthik to take us through the API approach.
Thank you. So, okay, I guess you guys were paying attention all this time, right? There's going to be a test later on, just so that you have so many interface points, so many APIs, so many components. And I'm just going to talk about how we in LSO committee go through this, right? How do we actually get down to actually producing APIs from all of those stuff that you heard about. We don't start in vacuum. In MEF, we have a services committee, and they were the morning presentations, I guess, David and others presented about various services that were actually defined in MEF or being defined in MEF. Right? Some examples are like there's SD-WAN service, carrier Ethernet, optical transport, IP, and there will be many others. So this is the starting point for everything that we do in LSO committee. We take those specifications that were developed in the services committees, and we analyze those and develop information models. So for example, converting the services to different LSO reference point information models that are relevant to the reference points. That's what really happens in the information modeling projects. And it's not a single project. There are a whole lot of bunch of family of projects in LSO committee that deal with this. So at the bottom, we have what we call MEF general common, right? That has like that information model has components like common MEF types, common MEF constructs like bandwidth profiles and so on. And then we have this project called MEF core model. The MEF core model builds on top of this common MEF types and defines a kind of taxonomy as well as behavior around these like products, services, and resources. So the MEF core model has common constructs, right? It doesn't talk about specific MEF services or specific types of MEF resources, just in general sense, common constructs. And just the behavior, it's not just the constructs, it's the information and the behavior that goes around it. So using that as a base, there are a whole bunch of projects that build on top of it. The first family of that is what we call MEF resource models. And I'm going to go sort of bottom up rather than top down. So the MEF resource model now takes this common constructs and adds information that is very specific, relevant to how you provision the resources. So for example, you might want to provision carrier Ethernet resources, like activate, right? So if you want to sort of provision EVC or Ethernet connection, what kind of information is needed to pass across the interface? And that's what we defined in this project. So it's not just provisioning connectivity, but also OAM, as well as for optical services, carrier Ethernet services, SD-WAN services. So all of this stuff out here. The second family of projects is the services information model. The services information model is sort of mapped fairly easily to the service definitions. I would say almost in many cases, like almost one-to-one. While in the resource models, of course, we have to look at the service definitions and identify what we need to do to actually provision the resource. In here, it's more like much easier. We just take the information here, develop the information models around this. And then there's the MEF business models, right, which again, based on the service specifications, identifies the commercial attributes and the characteristics that you need to order products and exchange information across like two service providers and the customers. So once we have the information model, we develop what we call interface profile specifications. So now, up to this point, it's all generic, right? It's not the MEF services as well as information models are not specific to any reference interface, right? Any reference interface points. The interface profile takes this information and applies it to specific LSO reference points. So in the Presto class of projects, it takes the information model, whatever it might be. So it might be information coming from the services model, it might be some information coming from the resources model, and then develops the requirements, use cases for the Presto reference point, right? So this is what we call IPS. So it involves like sequence diagrams, state diagrams, mostly UML constructs, and very formal definitions of the requirements and use cases. And the same in the Legato, in the class of projects, again, we take the service information models and define the behavior, the requirements, use cases, sequence diagrams, flow diagrams, and so on, and publish them as interface profile specs. And finally, the Sonata deals with the same kind of information, but at the product level, right? So you have resource, services and products applied to the different reference points. And finally, like using this, we start working on the APIs. So the APIs are actually takes this information, UML information, and the requirement use cases and map it to specific data schemas. So one example of this could be at Presto, like for example. Now this is not like one size fits all, right? In Presto, the industry more or less has adopted netconf yang as the, or restconf yang as the kind of, I would say, data schema or the API language to really model these interactions. So in the Presto class of projects, we take the IPS, the Presto IPSs, and develop the yang schemas, either by using tooling or by hand. And we develop the interactions, the use cases, and encoding. And then we work with other industry bodies. We don't stop just at that, to provide some kind of reference implementations, right? So in case of Presto, the example is like ONF transport APIs. So the MEF Presto APIs are built on top of the ONF transport APIs. And we do this so that we don't really reinvent the whole wheel. We can leverage what is already developed in the industry and just add the MEF specific value adds onto these APIs. In case of Legato, we found that like there's more traction with JSON schemas and open API formats. So here now again, we are working closely with the ONAP external API project to sort of, as a starting point, get their APIs in, and then add MEF-specific schemas to this, right? The MEF value adds, the MEF services. And in case of Sonata, we are working closely with TMF Open APIs, again, as an industry standard, and developing schemas which are specific to MEF products and services. So in reality, like when we really talk about MEF APIs, it's not something that's done in isolation or in sort of in a shell. It's a whole driven process. And when you look at this, again, you should not think waterfall, right? Even though the presentation here, it looks like you do one thing at a time. Really, like in LSO committee, all we really need is the service specifications, because that's something that is kind of the starting point. But often you find that the IPS projects, the information model projects, and the SDK projects are going in parallel. In some cases, the SDK projects may be ahead, right? In case of Sonata, the SDKs are way ahead, like the open APIs were ahead of the work being done in the UML and the IPS. But eventually, they will catch up, they will align up, and this sort of gives us kind of an agile way of getting stuff out fast, but at the same time ensuring that everything is in good, I would say, shape, and very well vetted, very well reviewed, and so that we are confident enough to put a MEF stamp on it, a MEF standard stamp. I did mention that we have the information models projects and we have the IPS. And some of you might be wondering, okay, why do we have so many layers? I mean, why do we need to do an information model as well as a separate IPS? And here is an example of this. The MEF services models is applicable not just to one reference point in the LSO, but it's 5 reference points. The same model is used to analyze what information we need to pass across the legato interface that's between your BSS systems and your service orchestration. It also is applicable to the Sonata interface where the 2 service providers, business systems, exchange information about the products, right? Because the products are not in vacuum. It's based on the service definitions. So the same service model, not all of it. Again, not everything that is in the service model is going to be used at Sonata or at the legato. There will be some stuff which there is some kind of analysis that goes behind the scenes, and a flavor of those service models are applied at Sonata and at the legato. And the same thing applies at Interlude, right? Interlude, like you have your 2 service orchestration systems talking to each other. Again, the service model is going to be having all the information, all the attributes defined, but not all of them might be applicable at the Interlude reference point, and so on, right? So Cantata and Allegro. So this is one good reason like why we do information modeling first, which is like looks at the holistic, the entire information, and then we look at the different reference points, the use cases, and pick what we need to actually develop the interface profile specifications. So, and now finally, like let's look at how we really develop APIs. And now when we say APIs, again, it's not a monolith, right? We in MEF see at least the APIs as made up of 3 components or 3 high-level, I would say, component streams. The first is the API framework. So what we mean by API framework is whether you choose something that's like RESTconf Yang, or you use Tosca templates, or you use like open APIs, JSON schemas, all of these systems have some framework components, like what is the wire protocol that you're using, right? So in case of JSON schema, it's going to be HTTP REST. In case of netconf Yang or RESTconf, there are some already existing framework features that you can leverage, like the security and encoding schemes and the notification mechanisms. These differ from different API frameworks that we choose, right? These are not going to be same. If you use netconf Yang, we'll be using probably like something like HTTP push, while as against if you're using like open API schemes, we might be using a different notification mechanisms or framework. And the second part of the components is what we call product or service agnostic framework, right? This includes information about the specific products or services that are independent of any specific example. So this is something that's common across all of these products. So this includes information and operations. So it's both data and behavior. And finally is the MEF secret sauce, the MEF stuff what we call data or payload schemas. And this is where really like we are actually adding our information, like our MEF service, like Access E-line products or SD-WAN products information into the APIs. So looking at these 3 major like components, you can really like mix and, in theory, you could actually mix and match the first 2, right? But what really we really want to focus on and bring value is the third one, which is the MEF components, right? Like the service definitions and our information models based on the service definitions. So this is why we can, when in the previous slides, we could say that, okay, you could use TMF APIs, you could use ONF, you could use IETF as kind of the framework to pass our information across. Finally, this is the last roadmap slide. As you can see, our LSO committee, we have huge number of projects. Some of them are actually standards, have been delivered. Some of them are in progress, some of them are in planned. So I'm not really going to go through all of these projects, But just as an sort of baseline, in the next quarter, we expect to be working on 17 to 20 projects in the LSO committee at a time, right? So just that's sort of to give you the and sort of insight into how much work is there to be done. So from these, like what I would like to point out, like the key project that I would like to pull out is there a pointer here? No pointer, okay. So one is the MEF services model for SD-WAN. So that's actually making good progress, and we expect it to go to letter ballot in the next quarter. So this project is defining a services model for the SD-WAN services. On the Sonata group of projects, the requirements and use cases for most of the Sonata functions are almost there, are already out, or are coming along. We are actually have been working on the Sonata interface profile specifications. That's actually the Sonata APIs. And we have some new projects like trouble ticketing already proposed to go into like in project phase next quarter. On the Legato side, again, we have like the generic Legato APIs in progress. And our initial focus is going to be developing the SD-WAN and carrier Ethernet service models for the Legato APIs. And at the Presto, like we have a bunch of already existing standards. The one that's for the carrier Ethernet provisioning and carrier Ethernet OEM. Those have been published and available as standards. The work on this service activation is ongoing, should be delivered soon, like probably in next quarter. And we'll be starting work on Presto SD-WAN soon, or we expect to be starting. What we are really not focused on at this point is Cantata and Allegro. That's the interface to the customers. So if your companies are interested in these APIs or any of this work, please contact us, and we'll just help you get involved. We really need help because, like I said, we have a lot of projects to do, and we need your help to be involved to actually take it forward. Right, thanks.